Today we have very interesting invited lecture. I believe it's very nice tradition to keep going, to invite very interesting persons for our lecture courses. And today it's Dr. Vincent Knight. Yeah, I believe I can sure say that. And he work in game theory and especially in algorithmic. I mean, he used programming to implement some of the stuff from game theory, and I think NashPy and Axelrod has your contribution, yeah, these packages. So it will be a very interesting for students and invited everyone to hear about the experience and the application of game theory. And I believe today we will talk about repeated games and the prisoner's dilemma in some part. And maybe maybe Vincent also will share some his research or example of his research with us. And we will be very. I personally very grateful that you answer my email and agree to have this lecture happen. So it's your words, please.
Well, yeah. Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Alexei, for the invitation. I mean, it was lovely to receive your email, and it's one of the positive aspects of our socially distanced reality that it's relatively simple for me to be able to visit you and give you this talk about my research. So yes, my name is Vince, and I'll start by introducing myself a little bit. I just want to preempt things by saying, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to interrupt me as I go. I'm also very happy to take questions at the end, but if you want to stop me or interrupt me, I'm very welcome to that. You can either unmute or just put in the chat, and I should be able to see it. In which case, I'll happily take any questions as we go. So yes, I'm going to be talking today about reproducing research on cooperation. And hold on, the first slide transition failed. Let me try that again. Let's try again. There we go. So I work at Cardiff University in Wales, where I work in the mathematics department. I have one of those academic pathways that you don't recommend to anyone. So whenever students are asking me for advice, I always say, well, you should do this. It's not what I did, but I don't recommend what I did. In that I studied at Cardiff University, did my PhD at Cardiff University, and got my postdoc, and now my permanent position at Cardiff University. So I have a very reduced kind of view of what a university is, because I really mainly know Cardiff. I'm also a fellow of something called the Software Sustainability Institute. And I'll talk about this a little bit more as we go, but it's an institute in the United Kingdom that's interested in making research with software better. More and more of the research we do, not just in mathematics or computer science or in economics, but in all fields, use software. And I am one of, so every year there are 16 fellows of this institute that get chosen, made, and I am one of them from a few years back. And so a big part of my interest is in software, is in doing research with software in the right way. And then finally, this logo down here is for a library that Alexei has mentioned, the Axelrod Library. It's one of two game theoretic software packages for which I'm a contributor. The other one is NashPy, which is a library that can be used to obtain Nash equilibria for two-player games. And the Axelrod Library is one I'm going to be speaking about a bit more today. And then finally, in my free time, I like to play frisbee with my dog. So him and I look to fly through the air and catch frisbee. Well, he does the catching and the flying. I just do the throwing. So that's a little bit about myself. But fundamentally, I am a game theorist. So this is a photo of myself. I'm the one with the big mouth open, and Dr. Glinazzi, who is a postdoc in Germany. And this is actually on a street in Namibia, where we went to give a conference, and it's Nash Street. We went past the street sign, like, oh, it's Nash Street. We should go and go get a picture in front of that. So my mathematical career did not start in game theory, but now it's very much pretty much all I do. And I like to apply game theory to more theoretic questions, like some of the ones I'm going to be talking about today. But then I've also used game theory looking at healthcare and looking at, and by healthcare, I mean models of hospital interaction from a game theoretic point of view. So that's also some of the work I've done. So this is a headline that came out not too long ago. Well, actually, it is quite long ago. It's just time has gotten a bit strange in these times, where in the UK, all of a sudden, I believe it was our death rates. It might have been our case rates. I don't fully remember. But all of a sudden, they jumped up. From one day to the next, there was a massive jump. And it was because we found out that the people who are basically keeping track of the number of cases or deaths were using Excel, sending these Excel spreadsheets back and forth to each other. And at some point, the particular version of Excel that was being used had a limit on the number of columns or the number of rows that could be used. And so all of a sudden, poof, a whole number of cases and deaths just disappeared. Thankfully, this was caught. But this type of problem where we use software to do research or indeed something perhaps more fundamental, like keeping track of the pandemic, can lead to errors if it's not done correctly. Using software is not trivial. And in fact, software, my personal hypothesis is that software that is made and designed to be easy to use is often where the biggest problems can happen. Another example that also takes a swipe at Excel, but there's lots of other examples of other pieces of software, is genetic research. There's an estimate that around 20, maybe even more % of all genetic research could be wrong, because when you put genes into Excel, Excel very helpfully changes the data you have input because it thinks the gene name is a date. And so all of a sudden that data becomes wrong. And that's another example of research being incorrect due to improper use of software. So that's one big point of this, okay? That idea that, you know what, a lot of research is simply not quite right because of the improper use of software. This is a tweet that was about 4 years ago. I can't say I know Dr. McLeod terribly well. I'm not very familiar with their work, but for some reason it came along my timeline in Twitter. And Dr. McLeod works with lizards. Lizards are cold-blooded. Cold-blooded animals like to find heat. And I preempt anything I'm saying about biology here, that if any of those facts are not true, then I agree with you. That's my basic understanding of cold-blooded animals. And so Dr. McLeod was doing this experiment, and the tweet describes it, right? So the idea is they're in there's two lizards. They're in an enclosure, and in the middle of that enclosure, there is a source of heat, that hot podium. And so the idea is to see how these lizards will compete for that heat, okay? Perhaps, and this is the point where I certainly am not familiar with Dr. McLeod's research, perhaps one hasn't been fed that day. So the experiment is to see that the lizard that hasn't been fed, is it more likely to win the heat or not? Or maybe they're genetic markers that they're trying to gain some understanding of behavior from, or something like that. And the bit that's not on this slide yet is the photo that came with this tweet, which is simply that the two lizards decided to share the podium. So the idea was that you wanted to see this fight, and the situation was put in place to see the fight, and I imagine to see who's going to be the winner. But actually the behavior that emerges from those very simple set of rules is a cooperative one. These two lizards said, well, let's not fight. Let's just lie here and both enjoy the heat, right? And so, I mean, that's a lovely outcome. I mean, not for Dr. McLeod, because no doubt, you know, she wanted them to fight, but that is a lovely outcome from the point of view of, look, we built what was supposed to be a very uncooperative environment, but these two lizards essentially just got along and decided to cooperate. And that's what game theory is about. Game theory is about understanding what behaviors emerge at a higher level from what we know about the micro interaction. So measuring that macro behavior from the micro behavior. So the micro behavior here being they want heat, there's only one source of heat. And then the emergent behavior that in this particular case, Dr. McCroyd was unable to predict, or at least according to the tweet, was unable to predict, is that they shared the podium. And that basic idea can actually be represented with this particular mathematical game, which is called the prisoner's dilemma. And so the way we're going to talk about this is we have two players. Some of you might, perhaps all of you are familiar with the prisoner's dilemma, so forgive me for going over it again. We have two players, and one of the player decides which row we're in, and one of the player decides which column we're in, okay? And if both players choose to be in the first row and the first column, so if both players choose their first option, they both get a score of 3, okay? And so think of a score as a good thing. 3 is pretty good. But if we're both at this score of 3, then me, if I control the row, I will just go, well, you know what? I'm changing my row to the second row to get a 5. And you'll now actually get a 0 because we flipped the matrix for the column player. You'll get a 0. And so actually you will then change us to be in the 1. And so we end up with a 1. So this is a prisoner's dilemma. The usual story is 2 prisoners. They've been separated by policemen, and the police are questioning them. And if they both stay quiet, they'll both go to prison for a medium amount of time, let's say 10 years. But if one of them gives evidence about the other, then the police offer them a deal. And so they will go free. But if they both give evidence, then they'll both go to prison for 50 years or something like that. So that basic idea is this tool, this game here, can be used to understand why and how cooperative behavior emerges. Because where this game gets interesting, by itself, this game is not interesting. The Nash equilibria is for us both to defect, because I will always, both to choose the second score, because I will always get a higher number if I choose the second option, right? And choosing that second option is defecting, choosing that first one is cooperating. And indeed, if in a single interaction, you know what, we should not necessarily be nice, not necessarily pay a little bit to help someone else. The only reason we get to start doing that is if over time we start to meet again. And if we meet again, then we'll remember our interactions at previous times. I'll remember how trustworthy you are, and we'll build up that reputation. So to study this, I am one of the core contributors for a piece of software called the Axelrod Library. And when I was putting this talk together, I was like, oh, let me go describe this, draw a little picture that describes the library, the software library. But actually, the one I gave in 2015 at the UK Python conference is perfectly adequate. Things have moved on a little bit. It's got a lot more capability than this, but this gives a good enough idea. There's a bunch of code here. The first to run what is called a tournament, where we get lots of pieces of code to play that prisoner's dilemma multiple times against each other. The particular players that we have, the particular strategies, are all modular pieces of code. This is all written in Python, by the way, but that's not terribly important right now. And so we have a cooperator, and a cooperator just always chooses the first option. A defector always chooses the second option. Tit for tat starts by cooperating and then just mimics what the opponent does. And there's lots of other strategies. In fact, now the Axelrod library has more than 200 strategies, arguably has an infinite amount of them. As well as that, and part of the success of this library is that it's written with high standards of research software engineering practice, in that it's fully documented, and importantly, it's fully tested. So for every file in the library, there's tests that confirm it's correct. And the reason that's important is, first of all, as you'll see as I carry on with this talk, it does what it says it does, and we know that it says what it does. But also from the point of view of open source software, this is on GitHub, it's an open source software, a piece of software, is it's very open to contributions, pardon me. And because people might come to it, they see this high level of testing and correctness, they know that any contribution they make won't be just lost, so to speak, or indeed can't break anything. And to date, we've had quite a high number of contributors. The first paper that described the library actually had 21 authors on it. And since then, the number of contributors has gone up. Now, the reason I'm telling you about this is about this piece of paper, this piece of research. You might have heard about this. It's one of those pieces of research that's kind of gone through the academic wall and is somewhat popular. When I tell, friends of friends that I study the prisoner's dilemma, they go, "Oh, but I know about that. That's been solved. You should just do tit for tat." And that's because of this work. So in 1980, Robert Axelrod put out an open invitation for people to, in a very similar way to the code I just described, send in pieces of code that describe behaviors for how to play the prisoner's dilemma in an iterated way. Obviously, in those days, it wasn't as simple as it is nowadays. I imagine it literally meant people sending in pieces of paper with code on it that then had to get transcribed and coded up. And in this first paper, because there's a second one, Robert Axelrod got 16 strategies. He actually got 15 strategies, and then he added in a strategy just played completely randomly. And some people wrote quite sophisticated strategies that used, for example, a chi-squared test to try and figure out if the person they were playing against over those 200 turns was playing randomly or not. So quite sophisticated strategies. And the strategy that won is tit for tat, this very simple strategy that starts by cooperating and then just does whatever the opponent did in the previous round. So if the opponent cooperated, it keeps on cooperating. If the opponent defected, it defects. But importantly, if the opponent says sorry and starts to cooperate again, it will start to cooperate again. And so this very simple strategy, you can essentially code in, well, it's certainly code in one line of Python, but you can even code in.
Sorry, Vincent,
please.
Sorry. Can I ask the question?
Please do.
I tried to reproduce this original Axelrod tournament, but I think I never did the tit for tat was winner. I do it a few times, maybe not too many, but not a single time tit for tat was a winner, and it was very strange for me.
If you wait for my next couple of slides, but thank you for that. You're not alone, because yes, you're not alone. You're not the only one. But yeah, it's fantastic to hear you did that. Before going on to that point, which is a really good point, the reproduction of the results, it's important to note that this paper has been cited a huge amount of times, and it's been used to validate understandings of why and how cooperation was evolved. Because the fact that tit for tat wins is an argument for why we all are essentially cooperative. We might not think that we're too cooperative, but we are. Fundamentally, human beings are an incredibly cooperative species. And one of the reasons was, your behavior has to be simple, because indeed, tit for tat is very simple, right? And that was kind of used as an argument, all right? So we have had our own go at reproducing the results. And Alexei, no doubt you can confirm, one of the problems about this is that the descriptions in the paper are vague. There are many ways you can interpret some of the descriptions of these 15 strategies in the paper. They are not clear. They are absolutely not clear, and they're certainly not rigorous. However, we have over the years tried many different attempts at reproducing them, various different strategies. And what you can see here is these are results over 1 million of random seeds, because obviously some of these strategies act randomly. So perhaps the results that Axelrod said were just one specific random set of events. So we've seeded the tournament, and I've got a data set with more than 1 million runs of exactly what Axelrod did, with various different interpretations. You can see whether or not we count self-interactions, whether we count the overall score or not, whether we count both. And what you can see here is that tit for tat originally ranked first, according to Axelrod's paper. It very rarely does rank first, whereas this strategy number 6, in Axelrod's original one, it actually came first most of the time. So if you were to ask me who won Axelrod's original tournament, I will say it's that strategy number 6, which is also a strategy by Ian Rappaport, who was the author of Tit for Tat. And it has tit for tat-like behavior, but it's a bit more complicated. It does some smarter things than tit for tat does. And that was the strategy that essentially wins most of the time. And there's again the number of wins. You can see that that strategy number 6 really does win the tournament most of the time. We've got a couple of tournaments that tit for tat did win, but at no point do the other strategies match. So we've not been able to get anywhere near the original results of Axelrod. And that's with a huge amount of computer power. And so the thing to kind of, well, that was my cat trying to come in. My cat's interested in what I'm saying for once. Sorry about that. So the kind of conclusion of that, right, is that the ambiguous descriptions in the paper won't necessarily lead to clear results, okay? I actually wrote in an earlier version of this, of that little work, of those little reproductions. I put up a blog post with it, and I had a few people actually read them and say, oh, actually, the way you've coded this particular strategy, I don't think it matches the description. I think it should be this. But because everything's there, because everything's tested, there's no ambiguity at all. And so it was great to have people be able to say, hey, I think this isn't quite right, because we could change it and investigate it and improve it, but still we can't reproduce it. So when we started this library, we actually emailed Robert Axelrod and saying, hey, we got this library, it's starting to gain a bit of traction, starting to get a bit of contributions and enthusiasm. Do you have the source code for your first tournament? And what about the second tournament? I haven't quite mentioned the second tournament yet, but that's coming. And he said, nope, first tournament basically gone, doesn't exist. But the second tournament you can find online. Great, fantastic. So this leads me to discuss Robert Axelrod's second paper that happened the same year. So the results of the first paper were published. Everyone knew that tit for tat won, and this conclusion that simple reciprocal behavior is the key to cooperation in complex environments. That message, that important message that has been used and used and used again, was known by everyone. And at that stage, 64 strategies were submitted to the second tournament. So quite a lot more strategies, right? And lo and behold, the somewhat neat kind of conclusion was that tit for tat won again. So even though everybody knew that tit for tat won the first tournament, and lots of people wrote strategies to try and, defend against tit for tat still won. So it seemed like this overall idea of simple reciprocal behavior, and Axelrod writes down 4 rules of behavior. It seems like that's the key. That's why we cooperate. So the code is written in Fortran, and this is the code. You can go get this code at I think it's at Rappaport's website, but you can go not Rappaport's website, pardon me, Axelrod's website. And it looks like this. If you know Fortran, this might be somewhat familiar. Fortran's not necessarily a complicated language. You can work your way through this one. This is tit for tat, I believe. Yes, I think this might be tit for tat. And you can see that it's written by Rappaport. You can see some comments. You can see replaced by actual code, Ax93. We don't really know what that means, in all honesty. But this is supposedly the actual code for tit for tat in Fortran. One of the core contributors of the Axelrod library is not a game theorist by background, but is a fantastic software engineer, and that's been amazing for my own knowledge of software engineering. And they wrote essentially an add-on to the Axelrod library called the Axelrod Fortran library, which allows these Fortran programs, these bits of code written in Fortran, to speak to the Axelrod library, so that all our functionality that we've written to be able to reproduce tournaments and things like that could be used. And there's just a little diagram showing the way the Fortran code worked It had to keep track of things and pass them back and forth. It had to keep track of the turn number, the player's score, the opponent's score. In Python, because Python is a modern object-oriented language, we can just give it everything, and everything just knows everything, and you can just have everything at any point in time. So it's a bit more straightforward. But essentially, we just wrote a bit of codes to take one of our player histories, get the things that the Fortran code wants, pass that to the Fortran. And again, I'm just to be very clear, because this is important. We did not change the Fortran strategy. We did not translate the Fortran strategy. We used the actual Fortran code. So we downloaded the code and we used the actual code, all right? But what we can do is we essentially resurrected the code so we can speak a modern language. And I use the modern word very loosely because, frankly, Fortran's making a bit of a comeback. If you want to make a lot of money, learn Fortran. Don't sue me if you don't make money when you learn Fortran. That's what we did. And importantly, we're speaking directly to the code that was originally written in 1979. And here are the results. You can see if we rerun the tournament that tit for tat does win, okay? And again, you see there that we've had to try all sorts of different ways of measuring the results, right? Whether or not we include the self-interactions, whether or not we include this, whether or not we include that. How you actually measure things. Do you take a mean over repetitions or a repetition over the mean, et cetera, et cetera. But what you can definitely see is there's not many strategies that are on that y equals x line. So we do reproduce the actual result of tit for tat winning, but there's all sorts of strategies for which we are very confident that the actual code does not do what was reported in the paper, okay? Now, I am not suggesting that Robert Axelrod is lying in his paper. Absolutely not. So certainly not for one of these strategies down here. Frankly, who cares? But all we can say is that the code that's currently there, which from that email is supposedly the code that runs that software that was run to that tournament, does not do what the tournament said. All right, and that comes back to my very first slide about the error in Excel. It's that improper use of software has led to errors. Okay. We then ran Axelrod's tournament against, we added one strategy from our library to Axelrod's tournament. So we went back to 1979 and we took all these modern strategies that exist and tried to see if we added a 65th strategy, could we win Axelrod's tournament? And so no, that red line is actually at rank 2. So no, tit for tat still wins if we add one more strategy. This does all fall apart if we run a strategy with a tournament with every strategy we have. We have more than 200 strategies available, and some are incredibly sophisticated. And so if we were to run Axelrod's tournament with all the strategies available to us now, as opposed to all the strategies that Axelrod had back then, the conclusions would in no way be the same. Because some of the strategies that win, this is actually a plot of the cooperation rate amongst them, okay? And so what you see, the strategies that win are at the top here. And they all behave in a very cooperative way with each other. But against the lower behaviors, lower strategies, they kind of learn to be a bit more aggressive. And actually, some of these strategies are incredibly complex. And so that explanation of how does cooperation emerge, well, we still don't know, frankly. And the work of Axelrod is very, very interesting. It's fantastic and it's brilliant. However, the results and the conclusions have been generalized for much wider environments than they consider. But the main takeaway is that having the code does not mean you necessarily have exact results, all right? So even the code here is not sufficient to reproduce the results. This kind of makes me think of this tweet that I saw a while back. You can download our code from the URL supplied. Good luck downloading the only postdoc who can get it to run though. So in research, at one point, really everyone was very excited about the idea of making your code just available online somewhere, right? Like Robert Axelrod's one. But like with Robert Axelrod's code, that's still not enough to get it to even work, right? And so what do we do about this? What do we do about all the research that's being done that uses software? More and more research is using software if we cannot reproduce it. That's actually, in some scientific principles, a defining principle of what science is, the ability to reproduce it. So what do we do? Do we just panic and who cares, right? Because what can we do? There's nothing we can do. And the answer is no, absolutely not. Here's a couple of tweets that went out when Microsoft bought GitHub. GitHub is the big open source software collaboration place, for want to, there's various things it could be called. And Microsoft bought it. And so a lot of people perhaps panicked a little bit that Microsoft was buying it. Microsoft has proved to be a fantastic steward of GitHub and open source software in general. But one thing that they said is putting your code online is not enough, because once you put it online, it could still change. Like Robert Axelrod's code, I don't know if it's the exact same code that was run there. And so there's lots of archival processes. So there's a piece of software, a service called Zenodo. It's actually run by CERN in Geneva that does exactly this. It archives software, so you know it is software that you say it is, and it hasn't changed. This is another solution. This is actually it's actually one of the sons of one of the core contributors of the Axelrod Library, but it's also a student of mine that has worked on the library a lot. This comes up with a solution that uses blockchain and version control and Bitcoin and all these kind of things. I'm not suggesting that's a good idea, but we can come up with all sorts of very, very good technological solutions to this. But Lego grad student, I don't know if anyone follows them on Twitter, but they're a very funny Twitter account. But at one point, they asked for some help with something, and lots of people on the internet, like when you ask for help, suggest using something, and they said use Git, which is a version control system. And he basically this Twitter account got a lot of people telling them to basically getting a bit fanatical about Git, and this leads to this problem between technical solutions like the blockchain and culture. And that is really what we're talking about here when we talk about making our research reproducible, this balance between technology and culture. Because in research, a lot of the incentives in place, the things that get you promotions, get you permanent positions, don't really care whether or not your paper can be reproduced, right? It doesn't really matter. So when I'm telling someone in a high, very successful position, getting way more grant funding than I do, hey, if we work together, we have to do research in this way. They tell me, no, we don't. I don't care. In a way, they're right. They're right, because it doesn't really matter. They will get their promotion whether or not their research is reproducible. I don't offer the solution here. But it is an interesting problem to deal with. One attempt at this I've mentioned before is the Software Sustainability Institute, which is in the UK, and there are various similar institutes throughout the world of people just trying to educate and improve the culture around using software properly, and essentially learning from what people do in industry, right? If someone stops working at Google, people don't all of a sudden have no idea to run whatever particular thing they were doing, right? So software is not this archaic thing that has to be complicated. It can be written in a way that is clear and reusable and reproducible. There is something called a research software engineer, and this is a job title that has slowly become more knowledgeable, slowly appeared, pardon me, of people who do research, but whose only kind of specialty is the software part of it. And then there are journals. There are journals that are only interested in software. And so this is the Journal of the Open Source Software. I'm actually an editor for this journal. And so the idea then of kind of bringing the modern aspect of the importance of software to the old currency of publications together. And finally, the carpentries. The carpentries are a set of courses that are available to anyone. The resources are all free that teach you how to do all these things. And one of the three things are this idea of bringing documentation, modularity, and testing together. But I won't talk about this too much, but that's some of the stuff that's covered in these sorts of things. And now to give you an example of some work that is reproducible. This is the paper that announced the Axelrod Library. There is, as I said, 21 authors. I couldn't fit them all on this slide, so I'm using the shameful et al. Here. And what we did already there was 113 strategies at the time of writing that. There are more now. But we got this tournament running. And as you can see, these two strategies here that won, they were actually strategies that were submitted by a high school student. They're no longer the ones that win, but it was, again, a nature of the open source, open source nature of this software that anyone could contribute. Now, this is another piece of work. And here, what we're doing, what you're seeing in front of you there is actually a strategy. It's something called a finite state machine. And the idea is that you can encode behaviors. And so what this is saying is you start by cooperating, and then you read the first letter as the input from the other players. So if they cooperated, you cooperate and go back to state 1. However, if they defected, you defect and go to state 13. And then you can just read that map of behaviors. And what we did in this paper was show that you could, by training these sorts of structures with no insight and certainly no simplicity, that thing on the screen is certainly not simple, you can get strategies that outperform known strategies that were designed by people, so to speak, as opposed to ones where we get the machines to algorithmically create these. And so what we're essentially doing here is we create a structure like this, we get it in a particular environment, and then we make a small change. So we move one of the arrows, or we change one of the letters, and we see if that becomes better. And then it just does this reinforcement learning and algorithmically improves itself. And we were able to show that that does produce dominant strategies for the IPD. And this particular strategy here is, again, what that strategy does against a number of opponents. And you're seeing there that this is, again, the cooperation rate. The high, that first rectangle at the top is everyone's actually cooperating with everyone else. But you can see that it learns almost a tit-for-tat-like behavior against the other strategies, where it's kind of flipping between cooperating and defecting. But you'll see it's a lot more subtle than just doing tit-for-tat. It's a lot more complex. And that's the emphasis here, that this idea of simple behaviors are better is simply just not correct. This is another paper that looked at evolutionary algorithms, so where our strategies specifically needed to interact with each other. And we did the same thing. We let the algorithms learn and just let them loose. And if you stare at that for long enough, what you actually see are the spots of a leopard or the stripes of a zebra. What these algorithms do is these strategies actually automatically learn through evolution, through an evolutionary process, to recognize each other. And so this particular strategy, it will cooperate twice and then defect. And if the opponent cooperates twice and then defects, it's essentially done a secret handshake, and it knows, oh, you're like me, so let's work together. And so it goes off somewhere and basically can possibly end up in this loop of just constant cooperation. But if I cooperate twice and then defect, and then you don't do exactly that, so let's say, for example, that you cooperated 3 times, then we'll go off into this much more complicated behaviors where I know that you're not like me. So some conclusions. Code should also always verifiably do what you think it does. You shouldn't have to trust the code. You should know that it does what you think it does. Open code makes for better research. This is something that I'm adamant about. If your code is open, then it can only be improved. Like, for example, my first blog post where I put up when we tried to reproduce the results of Axelrod, people were able to come and take a look and say, oh, but that's not right. I don't think that should be that. And that's great. That helps improve the process. And then I'll finish up with this this message from Julie. So Julie was a student in France, and I believe as part of her degree, she had to contribute to an open source project. This happens a lot, every now and then we just get someone that comes and just wants to write a line or fix a typo or a spelling mistake or something like that. So obviously they just need to make some sort of contribution. But Julie turned up and made amazing contributions to the library, not just contributing new strategies, but fixing some things, bettering some of the logic, improving some of the code. But kind of one other kind of beneficial aspect is that real sense of community that gets created. Some links. This is the slide that I normally put up. A slide like this I normally put up at real live conferences to say, if you're going to take a picture of a slide, take this one, because there's links to anything that might be interesting there, and you can always get in touch with me, and you can. But that's all I have to say. So I apologize if I've gone off for a little bit too long, but if you do have any questions, I'd be delighted to take them.
No. Thank you. It's totally fine. I think it's very interesting presentation, and I also
Thank you.
read a couple of new things about Axelrod. And I have a question about I add neural networks, I think, and launch, and they were winners basically many times. And
Yes.
it was some random. I mean, I didn't take all strategies, but I just make some random variety, approximately 15, I think. But I have a question. This neural networks, INN, they were mm, they were learning before the start or during the run.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. The training that they've happened to the neural networks, so the coefficients of the neural networks, do they change as we're playing? So over the 200 repetitions of a game, do they change, or were they just fixed beforehand? Am I understanding correctly? Yeah. So no, the learning is offline. To use that technical term. So the learning is done before. They're trained in these heavy environments, specifically for training with tens of thousands of hours of computer time, something that Axelrod certainly couldn't have done in his day. We have had some attempts at strategies that learn over 200 turns, but really our results are just, they're just not enough time. There's not enough time to really learn anything.
Can I like if anyone else have questions, please write or indicate, and I will give you a possibility. But for example, if I have
put my cat back outside. Sorry. Yes.
For example, if I have patterns for every strategy, like before the run, because I have data, and I can train the algorithm so to recognize whom it plays, yeah, and try to adjust to have a best theoretic best response actually. So is it possible to construct such strategy?
So that's actually a really interesting question. My colleague, Dr. Glanazzi, that was in the photo with me in Nash Street, she did exactly that. She trained a recurrent neural network to recognize, she took sequences of plays and found best response sequences of plays. So importantly, not trying to recognize who your opponent is, but trying to recognize what your best response should be to that. Now, it's not necessarily the same thing. And then tried to train a recurring neural network to it. And I think the answer is it works okay, but it's not necessarily able to, at this stage, perform too strongly. And I was really hopeful for that work because it was at the same time that AlphaGo beat Go. I don't know if you heard of that. And the game of Go has now been beaten by computers by a very clever way where we fed a computer a lot of data of gameplays. And then after feeding it data of gameplays, we got the computer to play against itself. And then it basically designed a whole new ways of playing Go. And so that's fascinating. So I was almost hoping that we'd be able to do the same thing with the much simpler game, The Prisoner's Dilemma. But I think the challenge with that, and this is just a hypothesis, it's not something I've looked into myself. I think the challenge with that is too much time in your 200 round repetition is spent recognizing. And fundamentally, you need to very, very quickly decide if what type of opponent you have. Like, for example, in the strategy I mentioned with it's 3 rounds. If you see C and D, that's my handshake, right? But that doesn't mean it can't be done. It's just that we certainly haven't done it yet. It would certainly be an interesting avenue of work. If you think about where recurrent neural nets are really, really used nowadays, we all use them, are in our spam filters. Most of our spam filters are just take a couple of words and a recurrent neural network says, yep, this is spam, or it's not. So Gmail's spam filter is a recurrent neural network, or at least it was at some point. Who knows what it is now. And that's probably because, yes, a spam email, you can tell immediately, right? If we can all do it, within 3 lines, I'm like, oh, yeah, that's spam. I don't care about this. So it's easy to do that. But behavior where it's just 1 or 2 signals at a time, it just seems to be a bit harder. So I think the problem with trying to essentially pre-train to recognize everyone is it just takes you too long. and you're spending more energy training, recognizing than taking advantage of what you have recognized. But it's a good question.
Okay, maybe anyone else has some questions. So I will not, make solo here.
It's fine if there are no more questions. If anyone does have any questions afterwards or would like to get in touch, I'm always happy for people to reach out. So
I have like idea right now. Is it possible to make something like adversarial attack? When you learn networks, you have adversarial networks. When you have networks that learns and other networks trying to
yeah, it's a really cool idea.
So if you have like a very good strategy, can we arrange the tournament so this strategy will fail because the participants deliberately play against her, but not because they are playing against her, because they are bad for this particular strategy.
Yeah, there was a tournament that was run. I forget exactly when, maybe in the early 2000s, and a few people got upset with each other because one group of people submitted multiple strategies that learned to recognize each other.
I heard about that.
Have you heard about it? Right. And people got upset because they're like, this is not in the spirit. This is not what we should be doing, which is a valid point. But yeah, no, using, training that with networks, I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good idea. That would be really interesting to look at.
Okay, it seems that everyone everyone satisfied, or they understand everything or do not understand nothing.
It's the end of a long day. It's not a problem. I know what it's like. It's not a problem.
No, I have a question, Vincent.
Oh yes, hi.
And hi, Vincent. Thank you for presentation. It was great, awesome. I understood.
Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Maybe 10% of it, but still. Thank you.
Sorry about that. But thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's good that our teacher Alexei already told us some stuff that you presented today, and so it's good that you have some base. It's very good.
Brilliant. Great.
Yeah. I have a question, some practical question.
Of course.
Whether you involved in some, businesses, government initiatives where you apply your knowledge of game theory, all these strategies, all this stuff. Thank you.
I wish I could say something cool, like if I was, I couldn't tell you, but no. The answer is no. The answer is quite boring.
But you can tell about rhinoceros.
So I've done some various bits of applied work. So one of the things I mentioned at the start is doing a lot of work with healthcare. So our group in Cardiff, we do a lot of work with local hospitals, and so not using the prisons that I'm up, but using another piece of work, we were able to model 2 hospitals. So we started this study on these 2 hospitals, and we were trying to fit queuing models to both hospitals, right? So get a theoretic model of the hospital so that we could then go, now if you had 500 more patients a day, that's a huge number. If you had 5 more patients a day, what would the bed occupancy be, right? But we could not fit the models. When we took both hospitals separately, we could not fit the models. And then at some point we were like, you know what? If we model it not as 2 separate hospitals, but as 1 hospital, and if one hospital gets a bit full, maybe they start sending patients to the other hospital. If the other hospital gets full, maybe they start sending patients to the other hospital, right? Then immediately, poof, the model fit perfectly, okay? So what we were seeing was, even though it's not technically supposed to happen, there was this behavioral element where as the hospitals were getting fuller, they were not closing their doors, but they were encouraging people to go elsewhere. And so we built a game theoretic model of that to understand the effect of this behavior and the effect of incentives, because hospitals in the UK famously have to aim at 80% occupancy. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? So that's the type of work I've done using game theory. But Alexei's also mentioned another piece of work, myself and Dr. Glinazzi, actually, again, we looked at rhino poaching. And so we looked at rhino poaching. One technique used in rhino poaching is by the park rangers, by the people who take care of the rhinos, the good people. What they do is they take the horn off. And so they saw the horn off.
Can I make some pre-translation, because it's a difficult word to hear, and I'm afraid that no one understands.
Please.
Тобто він розказує, що він застосовував теорію для аналізу полювання на носорогів. Значить, справа в тому, що носороги, вони дуже, на них полюють заради рога. І дуже часто в Африці, значить, ці браконьєри вбивають носорога, вирізають ріг і просто лишають все там, що залишилось. І він намагався проаналізувати це, моделювати допомогою теорії. So, yeah, so I just explained about rhinoceros, okay?
Thank you. And so yes, taking off the rhino, taking the horn off the rhino is a technique, and we wanted to see at what point is that technique beneficial. So kind of similar to the whole idea of like, if you set up the system, what behavior will emerge? Because what happens in nature, what happens is the people who poach rhinos, we're often, I certainly believe they were the people that were poaching rhinos because they didn't have money, they were poor, they didn't have resources, and it was just worth so much. But that's not actually true. Often it's the people that have a lot of resources that are ones poaching the rhinos, because to poach a rhino, you need a helicopter, you need all this stuff. It's quite an intensive investment. And so often what happens is that even if you take the horn off, you get some poachers that have invested so much time and money into finding a rhino, they will kill it anyway, just to take the little bit of horn that is left. So at that point, what is the emergent behavior? Is taking the horn off a good or a bad thing? And so we did some work using game theory for that. So that was a rather long answer, and forgive me, but the very short answer, I've not done anything fancy for the government, but I have applied game theory.
I read one article, by the way. Thank you for your answer. Also, I read one article about blockchain technology. It was not scientific articles, more popular magazine article, and it was stated that game theory is one of the main base for blockchain technology, but I was not able to understand it very clearly how it became such. But maybe
I can answer you there either. I feel like you. Yeah, I know very little about the blockchain. I know the basic ideas of it, but it's just an expensive hashing function, right? I don't see where the game theory.
It means they exchange all this stuff between each other. Yes, this network, and this cooperation, or how it's called in blockchain, is built based on game theory. I don't know how exactly.
That is interesting. I'll have to look that up.
It is quite known fact that game theory is used. So you trying to calculate coalition of players sufficient enough to cheat the system, and so you try to find this coalition, and this coalition is right now it's like half of the all population of the Earth, so it's too many. So this is what stabilizes the Bitcoin and blockchain. Bitcoin basically that you can't cheat the system, because for cheating you need the cooperative behavior of half of all users of Bitcoin. Okay, so it's like basic idea.
Yes, it's interesting. In a way, I guess it's almost the other side of the GameStop story, right? Where there was this massive cooperative behavior from everyone on Reddit that made GameStop, the people who were shorting GameStop, have problems.
Thank you.
Yeah, but maybe I will at the end of semester add some lecture about application in blockchain if it's so interesting for the students. Okay.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
Okay, if no more questions, I think we can let Vincent go because it was very generous gift for us, 1 hour. So
it was a great pleasure. I really appreciate your questions, and thank you very much. And good luck with the rest of your studies under Alexei. I'm very confident you're in fantastic hands. So all the best to you all, and who knows, maybe we'll see each other in better times one day.
Yeah, maybe if I have some ideas, we can communicate in future. And
that would be great. That would be great.
Okay, so thanks for everyone for listening and participating, and bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you. Bye.